On my birthday, my son stood in front of everyone, raised his glass, and said, "To the man who used to build things." They all laughed. And I, the man they toasted like a relic, smiled to keep from breaking. They used to wait for my advice. Now they barely looked up when I entered the room. Once this company breathed with my vision. I laid its foundation with my hands, spent nights drafting contracts at our kitchen table, and drove deliveries myself when we couldn't afford drivers. Back then, my son used to watch me from the passenger seat, eyes wide with admiration. Now, he sat at the head of the boardroom I paid for, in the building my signature built, surrounded by people who called him visionary for recycling my strategies and dressing them in buzzwords. Meetings happened without me. Reports never made it to my desk. I had to hear about the new product line from a junior assistant who assumed I was just a visiting consultant. When I finally spoke up during one meeting, just a gentle reminder about an unresolved licensing issue I saw coming a mile away, he didn't even let me finish. "Dad," he said with that practiced smile, "you've done more than enough. Let us take it from here. Seriously, just enjoy retirement." Retirement? I hadn't retired. They had replaced me. It didn't happen all at once. It was in the slowly missed calls, the "you don't need to come to this one," the new passwords I never received, the way my parking spot quietly disappeared one morning and no one seemed to notice or care. At first I told myself I was imagining things. I chalked it up to growth, to letting the next generation lead. But deep down I saw it. The rewriting of a story I hadn't finished living, and the man holding the pen now was my son. He didn't fire me. He didn't have to. He just made sure that one day I walked into my own company and felt like a guest. Unwelcome, unneeded, outdated. That day I left the boardroom early. Nobody stopped me. Nobody even noticed. And as the door closed behind me, I didn't feel peace. I felt something colder, something like betrayal, dressed in politeness. And I knew for the first time in my life, they didn't just forget who I was. They erased me. But a man doesn't spend his life building without learning one thing: what you give away with trust, you can take back with silence. Friends, let me pause for just a moment. Please write in the comments, where are you listening from? And tell me, have you ever experienced something like this in your own life? If this story speaks to you, consider subscribing and sharing the video. It truly helps us grow this channel and bring more stories like this to light. Now let's continue. They called it a celebration. My son's birthday, a family-only gathering. I dressed carefully, polished shoes, a jacket my wife once picked out. Even though she's gone now, I still wear it for moments that matter. I arrived early, out of habit, brought a small gift, a fountain pen engraved, the same kind I used to sign our first contract. He used to say he wanted one just like Dad's, so I gave him mine. Not the original, but the meaning behind it. When I walked into the house, I noticed the pictures first. All new photos on the wall, the company's recent expansion, awards. Every frame was filled with polished smiles and clean suits. Not one showed where it began. No photos of the warehouse. No images of the gravel lot we poured concrete on ourselves. No framed shot of me, back bent, hauling crates in the snow when the delivery truck got stuck. I walked past them quietly. The dinner table was long, filled with laughter and noise and glasses clinking. They had already started eating. No one stood to greet me, not even my son. Someone moved a chair so I could sit, at the corner, at the edge of the light. They laughed about the old days, but not fondly, like a comedy they'd grown out of. Someone read a passage from one of the early ledgers I kept by hand. They imitated my writing, exaggerated the shaky lines. "Look at this," someone said, laughing. "He spelled expenses with 3 E's. Another added, "He was building an empire, not spelling bees." I smiled. That soft, quiet kind of smile you use when your heart starts folding in on itself. They didn't mean harm, I told myself. But then I heard it. My daughter-in-law leaning toward one of her cousins. "We let him keep an office at the firm so he doesn't feel useless." A whisper, but not quiet enough. It hit harder than a shout. So that's what I was now. A sympathy desk. An old man clinging to purpose like a ghost in a hallway no one wanted to walk. I looked around the table, the place I once led from, now a performance I wasn't part of. They passed plates and poured wine, joked about profit margins like stockbrokers, but none of them had ever gone hungry waiting for an invoice to clear. None of them had missed anniversaries to drive across state lines for a handshake. None of them had bled on those blueprints. I picked at my food, said little, watched a room full of people celebrate what they thought they built, alone. No one noticed I hadn't eaten much. No one asked how I was doing. No one even thanked me for the pen. But I watched, and I remembered, not out of spite, but clarity. Because storms don't always start with thunder. Sometimes they begin with silence at the end of a long table. And the man who leaves early, unnoticed, but not empty. That night, I didn't sleep, not because of anger, but because something in me had shifted. They wanted the legacy without the labor, the name without the burden, and the man who built it all. They had mistaken him for decoration, but I was never made to be ornamental. I was made to build, and they had just reminded me that I still could. The building always looked different in the early morning, empty, honest. Before the noise and faces could blur what mattered, it used to be mine, not in title, but in spirit. Every hallway, every door, every creak of the floor had a memory etched into it. And for decades, I had arrived before the sun, coffee in hand, unlocking that front door like it was a sacred promise. That morning I did the same, out of habit, out of hope, out of some small part of me that still believed I belonged. But my key didn't turn. I tried again, slowly, firmly. It stuck, unmoved, cold. I stepped back, confused at first. Maybe the lock had jammed, maybe the security system had been updated, maybe someone forgot to tell me. I walked around to the side entrance, the one employees rarely used. Typed in the old code, denied. Tried the backup one I used with maintenance, denied again. Still, I didn't panic, not yet. I told myself there must be a reason. There always was in the old days. We solved things face to face. I rang the bell. After a minute, the door creaked open. A young man, someone I had hired just last year, stood on the threshold. He looked startled, as if he had seen a ghost. "Mr. Harris, I thought this office was empty now." He didn't wait for me to answer. He didn't invite me in. He simply closed the door again. Not rudely, not angrily, just as if I no longer existed. I stood there for a long moment, hands still in my coat pocket where the keys sat useless. No calls had been made, no memo sent, no notice given. They didn't need to, because to them it was already done. My presence was an echo, fading, inconvenient. I stepped back, looking up at the windows. The lights were on in what used to be my office. Someone was moving inside, rearranging, making space. The shelves I built had been cleared. The table I carved initials into with my son when he was 10. Gone. All that remained was the wall plaque that still bore my name. But even that I knew wouldn't stay long. I turned and walked toward the parking lot. The space where I used to park had been reassigned. My nameplate removed from the curb. The message wasn't loud. It didn't need to be, because it was clear. I wasn't fired. I wasn't confronted. I was erased, carefully, quietly, and completely. They took everything but my name, and even that they were learning to say without reverence, just as a formality, a historical footnote. The hardest part wasn't the lock. It wasn't the silence. It was the realization that I had stayed too long in a place that no longer saw me. And as I sat in my car, keys in hand, staring at a building I built brick by brick, I realized something brutal, but liberating. They may have taken the walls, but they had forgotten one thing. I still remembered how to build, and next time, I wouldn't leave the blueprints behind. I arrived early, as always. The boardroom was already humming. Suits, screens, catered coffee, all the symbols of power that once revolved around my presence. Now, I was a shadow in a place that used to feel like a second skin. I stood at the doorway for a moment, watching as my son laughed with the CFO, flipping through slides on his tablet like a conductor preparing an orchestra. No one looked up. There was no seat reserved for me, no placard with my name, no folder, no printed agenda. I scanned the long table. Nothing. And then quietly I slipped into a chair along the wall, not at the table, not among them, but behind. They didn't introduce me, not even as our founder, not even as former CEO. I was just a body in the corner. And when the meeting began, my son stood tall. Same sharp jawline I used to cup in my hand when he was small. Same voice, but now polished, colder. He walked them through a bold new strategy for national expansion. Charts, projections, and a headline he called the Vision 2030 Plan. I didn't need to read it. I wrote the original in 1998. Every slide, every data point, every region, it was mine. My strategy. The plan I had shelved years ago because the timing wasn't right. The same one I had once shown him over dinner. Napkin sketches and all. He had nodded back then, barely listening. Now it was his. Branded, repackaged, with his name stamped all over it. The board applauded. Loud. Too loud. One of them even leaned over to whisper, "Brilliant! Just what we needed." Another said, "This is the kind of leadership the company's been missing." And I sat there, still silent. The paper in my lap soaked up the sweat from my hands. They didn't remember. Or worse, they remembered, and it no longer mattered, because when a legacy is no longer convenient, it becomes something to bury. A relic, a wrinkle in a smooth pitch deck. I could have stood up, could have called it out, but I didn't. Not yet. Because a voice raised in defense of truth is powerful, but a voice held back, watching, listening, that's a storm gathering weight. I didn't need validation. I needed time. Because legacies can be stolen, but foundations? Those leave fingerprints no applause can cover. So I sat there and took notes. Not on the strategy. I already knew it. I took notes on them. Who smiled when he said my words? Who nodded along? Who looked confused and didn't ask? Who watched me and said nothing? That day, I didn't lose my place. They gave me something else, a clear view of who they really were, and the permission I never gave myself before to walk away, not with bitterness, but with a blueprint, one I would never share with them again. The letter came folded in a cream envelope. No call, no meeting, just a knock on the door from the new company accountant. Fresh face, nervous hands, eyes that didn't know who I had once been. She smiled politely, businesslike, as if we were strangers meeting for the first time. "Mr. Harris," she said gently, "the board wanted to offer you a final arrangement, a kind of formal closure, just something symbolic, a gesture." She slid the paper across my desk, and there it was, a check, a number so small it felt like a misprint. I didn't speak, not yet. She kept talking, about formality, transition, clean books, about how this would simplify things and honor our gratitude for your years of service. Years of service. 38 of them. 38 years of risking everything, of waking up before the sun and falling asleep with contracts on my chest, of holidays missed, of dinners interrupted by broken machines and missed shipments, of mortgage extensions just to cover payroll, of carrying not just my family, but dozens of others, men and women who depended on this company to feed their children. And now all of that had been boiled down into a line item, a gesture, a token payout. It wasn't the money. It was the insult, not because it hurt, but because it proved something final. They never understood what I gave them. This wasn't about ownership. It was about meaning. This company didn't start in a boardroom. It started in my garage, with blueprints smudged in grease, with bills I couldn't pay but refused to walk away from, with a wife who believed in me when the bank didn't. But they didn't see any of that. They only saw a man who had stayed too long. I picked up the pen, not out of anger, not out of surrender, but out of clarity. I signed. She smiled, relieved, and stood. I thanked her, gently, kindly. It wasn't her fault. She handed me a folder with the stamped paperwork, said her goodbyes, and walked out. And when the door clicked shut, I sat there in silence. The check lay on the table. I didn't even glance at it again, because I had already begun writing something far more valuable. In my drawer was a separate file, one I had been building quietly. Names, plans, contacts, legal documents, old ones, originals, and at the top, in bold letters, a title I hadn't used in years. Harris Holdings Founding Charter, 1986. They'd forgotten I kept the originals. They'd forgotten what I owned before I gave anything away. The land the headquarters was built on, still in my name. The patents for the first systems we developed, still mine. The brand rights, tied to my signature in an old clause they never bothered to read, still binding. I hadn't planned to use any of it. I had always imagined retiring with grace, fading with dignity, passing the baton gently to my son. But dignity, I realized, is not something you're handed. It's something you protect. And now I wasn't planning an exit. I was preparing a return, not to reclaim power, but to reclaim the truth. Because while they were busy replacing the man, I was quietly reawakening the founder. And the founder wasn't done. I wandered the corridors one last time, the fluorescent lights humming over polished floors that once felt alive beneath my footsteps. These halls had been my refuge through crises and triumphs alike. echoing with the sound of collaborators, deadlines met, and the steady hum of machinery that bore my fingerprints. Today they were silent, an empty stage after the final act. I passed door after door, stamped with new names. Directors I'd never met, vice presidents who arrived after the foundation was poured. Their offices gleamed with glass desks and abstract art that meant nothing to me. No one stopped to say good morning, to offer a nod of gratitude, or to ask how I was holding up. It seemed as though my 40 years of toil had evaporated into thin air. At the end of the wing, I found him, our longtime janitor, a stoic figure with kind eyes and hands marked by every stain and scuff of this building's history. He wiped a trash bin with the same tender care he'd shown when we first opened, as if preserving something sacred. He looked up and offered a simple nod, one that held volumes. In that brief gesture, I felt seen, not as a former CEO or a retiree, but as the man who had emptied his savings, who had labored through sleepless nights and tax audits, who had wrestled with every obstacle to carve this company into existence. His nod recognized the blood and sweat these walls had absorbed long before the glass and chrome arrived. I could almost hear the ghost of that first morning, the roar of the engine in my old pickup truck, the scratch of my pen on ledger paper beneath a single bare bulb. It was unbelievable to think that what began with a sketchpad and stubborn resolve had grown into a sprawling enterprise. Yet here I stood, stripped of title, watching a stranger's legacy take shape around me. Ending for who? He asked quietly, not shaming but curious, wondering if perhaps the company I loved was ending or if it was merely reborn without its soul. I realized then that endings are never simple. They pivot on truth, whose story gets told, whose efforts are honored, and whose dreams are carried forward. I didn't have an answer, but I felt resolve surging in my chest. This building might no longer belong to me in name, but every beam, every corridor, every memory would forever bear my essence. And as I felt the janitor's gaze steady upon me, I understood that true endings aren't about locking doors. They're about knowing when to open new ones. I watched them gather in the grand atrium, board members in crisp suits, family in tailored dresses, old friends sipping champagne as though this night was theirs to celebrate. Crystal chandeliers reflected on polished marble, but to me it felt like a theater set built for a play I no longer belonged in. My heart pounded softly, not with fear, but with a calm certainty. Tonight it would all end. I stepped forward, the metallic jingle of the keyring loud in the hush that fell as they noticed me standing alone. A dozen pairs of eyes flicked to the heavy ring in my hand. A dozen keys, each forged for a door that once bore my name. I felt the weight of every decision made within those walls, every long night spent mapping growth, every risk that had become a cornerstone of this empire. They expected a speech. They expected anger. Perhaps they even rehearsed applause for my final words of loyalty. But tonight would not be about them. It would be about truth. I lifted the keys and let them catch the light. Each one glinted like a memory. My first prototype workshop, the original safe in my home office, the warehouse I leased with my life savings. My voice was soft, but carried through the room. I'm done. Silence. I'm handing this over. Everything I built, from the foundation to the rooftops, every blueprint, every contract, every promise. The chamber stirred, confusion rippling through the crowd. My son opened his mouth as if to protest, but I held up my hand, steady. No speeches, no goodbyes, just this. I extended my palm, the keys resting there like an offered fate. They shimmered with the weight of my departure, casting small, broken reflections of faces that once honored me. I saw pride, hesitation, regret flicker across eyes that had once been blind to my presence. And then I turned away, not in anger, but with a quiet peace. My footsteps echoed down the corridor as the keys remained, a silent testament to what was relinquished, and what could never be erased. Behind me, the lock of legacy clicked shut, but ahead lay an open door I had forged for myself. And in that moment, I understood that walking away was not surrender. It was the strongest proof of worth I could ever give. For the first time in decades, I did not walk through those glass doors. No familiar click of my badge at the turnstile. No hurried footsteps toward my office before dawn broke. In the empty lobby, the security desk glowed with monitors showing everyone but me. The building that had once welcomed me like a home now waited for a tenant who never arrived. That morning, the phones began to ring. Soft at first, then insistent. They pinged on desks left unattended, rang through voicemail systems I had designed, and blinked on screens with my name stamped at the top. Nobody answered. No one even glanced at the caller ID. Pride, wrapped in the illusion of independence, had become their silent barrier. Emails piled up in inboxes awaiting approvals only I knew how to grant. Contracts stalled, stuck in digital queues. The custom software I'd built, the very heartbeat of operations, whirred in isolation without its primary architect. Deals unraveled like poorly tied knots. Clients who once trusted my signature walked away, uncertain who could honor the commitments we'd made together. I watched the newsfeed of the company's stocks. Dip, little red arrows marking the cracks my absence revealed. Analysts speculated on leadership gaps and shifting market confidence, unaware that the real fracture lay in forgotten knowledge and unreplaced experience. Yet through every misstep and financial stumble, no one reached out. No apology calls, no frantic emails begging me to return. They waited for each other to fill the void. But as the calls went unanswered and the systems glitched, they discovered something painful. Empty titles aren't enough to keep an empire standing. Later, I drove past the building. The sun caught the tinted windows, reflecting the sky in perfect stillness. I remembered the rush of pride I felt the day we poured the first foundation concrete, how we believed in possibility so fiercely it became real. Now that possibility faltered in vacant offices and unanswered phones. I felt no triumph, only sorrow for what was lost, because I knew they needed me, needed the man I was, the hands that had learned every bolt and cable by heart. But beyond sorrow, I felt resolve. Their world would echo with the silence I left behind, and in that echo they would finally learn the weight of footsteps they once ignored. It came quietly at first. An envelope slipped under the boardroom door before the morning session began. I imagine they thought it a routine filing, another administrative notice to ignore. But inside was a letterhead they hadn't seen in decades. My handwriting, my seal, my signature on the original charter. When the meeting assembled, I did not attend. Instead, I watched through discreet cameras as the lawyer walked in, confident, precise, carrying a single folder. She faced the board as if addressing a court. Papers rustled, chairs shifted, and then her voice cut through the murmur. My client is invoking the reversion clause in the founding charter. Silence slammed down like a gavel. He holds title to the land on which this headquarters stands. He retains ownership of the primary patents, and he still owns the founder's shares, vested and active under the original agreement. Eyes widened, faces blanched. Executives who once toasted new leadership now sat frozen, because while they had mocked the old man who wandered the halls, they never bothered to read the fine print. They never realized the fortress of legal protections I had woven around every corner of this enterprise, a fortress they assumed I would never breach. In that hush, the room felt smaller, the walls pressed in, witness to a betrayal of boundaries they didn't respect. Their spreadsheets, their grand plans, their shiny marketing campaigns, all suddenly teetered on the edge of nullification. No board resolution could override a charter. No title change could erase a founder's rights. I watched as their confidence crumbled. Deals that relied on my patents were now in jeopardy. Buildings they thought belonged to them suddenly required lease agreements. And those shares they treated as ceremonial turned out to carry voting power. A power they no longer controlled. There was no shout, no dramatic confrontation, just the slow realization that they had climbed a tower built on someone else's foundation, and now the ground beneath them shifted. In that moment, I felt no glee, only sorrow. I had not intended to wield the charter like a weapon, but a promise neglected becomes a wound. They had forgotten the man who had risked everything so that they could inherit a dream. Their ignorance forced my hand. As the lawyer collected her papers, I saw the board's new chair. Rise, my son, his face pale as if he'd swallowed regret. He opened his mouth, perhaps to protest or plead, but the lawyer shook her head. No words could alter what was written in ink decades ago, and so they sat, stunned, as the truth settled over them. The empire they believed theirs was never fully theirs at all. It had always belonged to the man whose name they now whispered with fear and awe. Behind that whisper, I heard something I hadn't felt in years: respect. That morning, their inboxes flooded at dawn, a cascade of legal notices from every corner of the company's infrastructure. Servers they thought they owned refused to boot without a valid license. Software they branded as proprietary flagged for immediate deactivation. And then in crisp black text, the eviction notice: your lease agreement has been terminated. Rental terms for 123 Founders Way apply retroactively. Panic rippled through the executive suite like an electric shock. They read the words again, hoping for an asterisk or a mistake, but none came. Their gleaming offices, once coveted symbols of success, now required rent paid to an owner they had never imagined. Meanwhile, the brand they had touted in glossy presentations vanished from trademark registries overnight. The logo on their letterhead, familiar to millions, no longer belonged to them. It belonged to Harris and Company, the reborn venture I launched in the quiet days after I walked away. I watched the chaos unfold from a distance, the same distance I had maintained since I handed over the keys. There was no triumph in their desperation, only a profound pity for a generation that believed inheritance was a birthright, not a responsibility. News spread fast. Clients whose contracts suddenly referenced Harris and Company paused, uncertain whether to continue. Partners who once courted the company now wondered if their alliance was sealed in shifting sand. And in the background, my new firm, small, nimble, and fiercely loyal, stepped forward. We offered continuity where there was confusion, trust where there was betrayal, and honesty where there was erasure. Within days, Harris and Company was valued higher than the entity that had cast me aside. We hired former employees who remembered the company's heartbeat. We restored the software licenses, reopened the buildings under fair terms, and rebranded ourselves without arrogance, simply stating the truth. This was the same vision reborn. As the world watched, the old company's leadership scrambled to negotiate lease extensions and emergency trademarks. They sent envoys to my office, flustered and apologetic, but I wasn't interested in their pleas. Their insistence now only underscored the magnitude of their mistake. Believing that power granted by birthright was immutable, I felt the weight of every night I spent drafting patents, every risk I took to secure land and licenses, every moment I dedicated to protecting this enterprise from exactly this kind of vulnerability. It was a bitter lesson writ across the faces of those who had mocked me just months before. In the midst of their undoing, I remembered the first contract I ever signed, ink bleeding on cheap paper, my trembling hand refusing to back down. That same hand now guided a new era, one built on respect, transparency, and the hard-won wisdom of betrayal. And as the old company's leaders stared at eviction proceedings and blank license keys, they finally understood why the founder's name mattered, not as a relic of the past, but as the guardian of every promise written in that founding charter. Because legacy isn't a birthday toast or a place at the table. It's the unseen clauses that hold things together when everyone else walks away. And in that moment, the world remembered. I wasn't just the founder they forgot. I was the one who still held the future in my hands. Word traveled fast through whispered phone calls and trembling emails. They wanted to meet. A dinner to clear the air, they said. A chance for reconciliation, for the founder to return and bless the legacy he'd fought to protect. They chose the same glass-walled restaurant where my wife and I had toasted our first successful quarter, where my son had learned to hold a wine glass. It was fitting in a bittersweet way that they sought closure in a place steeped in memory. But it was too late. By the time their invitations reached me, I had already laid new foundations, not merely rebuilding a business, but reinventing what true leadership looked like, one rooted in integrity, transparency, and respect. My new offices hummed with purpose. My team moved with conviction. Every handshake carried the weight of authentic commitment. We weren't just another firm. We were a standard of accountability, a promise lived out rather than just printed on glossy brochures. Their messages stacked up: pleas for conversation, thinly veiled apologies, frantic offers of partnership. I read them once, enough to know the words lacked sincerity, and then archived them unread. My evenings were now filled with strategy sessions and late-night calls with clients who trusted our word, not our reputation. There was no room for distractions, no appetite for false peace. When the date arrived, the reservation quietly disappeared from their calendars. The maitre d' called to confirm, only to be met with a curt cancellation. I could almost picture the tension, the board members glancing at watches, fumbling for explanations, wondering if they had been too late to mend what they'd broken. They labeled me emotional, as though passion was a weakness. But emotion drove every blueprint I drafted, every risk I took, every obstacle I overcame. It was the force that transformed a pickup truck and a dream into an enterprise. What I felt wasn't anger or spite. It was freedom. Freedom from the cloak of expectation. Freedom from betrayal disguised as loyalty. Freedom to chart a course defined by my own convictions. And in that freedom, I discovered something more powerful than any dinner appeasement. The certainty that I was building something enduring, something they could never replicate. Because while they sought to negotiate with the past, I was already forging the future, one built not on apologies but on unwavering purpose. He was the one I had trusted above all, my legacy handed to the hands I once guided. Yet when the world unraveled around him, he offered nothing but a hollow silence. No desperate phone calls, no voice cracking with regret, no attempt to bridge the widening chasm, just the absence of a single familiar presence. Mine. I learned of his resignation through a passing headline, buried between quarterly earnings and market speculation. The son I taught to negotiate deals, to stand firm in storms, had stepped down under the weight of losses he hadn't anticipated. A lonely figure in a sea of boardroom turmoil, he retreated without a backward glance. I didn't call him, not then, not ever. Because some bridges, once burned, illuminate their own lesson in the dark. I remembered the nights I held his homework in one hand and financial projections in the other, teaching him that responsibility wasn't just a word on a contract, but a promise etched in every choice we make. And yet in the silence of his exit, I didn't feel triumph, only sorrow. Sorrow for the son who forgot the man who built the path. Sorrow for a legacy almost lost to pride and unspoken truth. But sorrow can be the ember that sparks renewal. For as he vanished from the company he once led, I felt no urge to reclaim his role. Instead, I honored the lesson he embodied, that power without purpose is hollow. I moved forward, not seeking his forgiveness, but embracing the quiet space he left behind. Because sometimes the absence of one voice allows another to be heard, stronger, clearer, unencumbered by expectation. And in that space, I vowed to build not for inheritance, but for integrity, a legacy that no silence could ever silence. A soft knock at the door broke my quiet routine, an echo I hadn't expected but welcomed all the same. I opened it to find my grandson standing on the threshold, his face a mixture of determination and uncertainty. His ties were too long for his frame, his jacket slightly oversized as if he borrowed more than clothes. He borrowed courage, too. He held a worn envelope, edges frayed like memories, too heavy to stay pristine. "I read the old letters," he said, voice barely louder than a whisper. The ones you sent Mom before the acquisition. I didn't know what they did to you. I studied his eyes, bright, hopeful, the same eyes that watched me as a child while I drew blueprints late at night. He stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him, leaving the world of boardrooms and betrayal at the threshold. He unfolded a letter on the kitchen table, where decades of ink had bled with worry, faith, and love. I remembered writing every line, the weight of every failure, the spark of every small victory, the heartache when the family I built turned its back on me. My grandson's fingers traced the words I thought were forgotten. "I'm sorry," he said, the words tentative, as if he feared breaking something fragile. "They told me you just wanted to retire, that you'd lost interest. But this isn't retirement." I nodded, the lump in my throat reminding me why I had walked away. "I wasn't supposed to keep those letters," I admitted softly. "They asked me to let go, but I needed you to know what really happened." He looked up, eyes glistening. "I see it now. All of it. The sacrifices, the fights, the moments you kept going when no one else did." For a moment, time folded. I saw the boy who sat wide-eyed in my workshop, the toddler who tried to lift a hammer, the teenager who asked 1,000 questions about wires and profit margins. And now here he was, a young man carrying his own dreams, learning the weight of a grandfather's legacy. He closed the envelope and met my gaze. "I want to help," he said, "not take over. Help." His offer wasn't about duty. It was about understanding, partnership, trust. I laid a hand on his shoulder, feeling the warmth of his gesture. "Thank you," I whispered. "That means everything." In that moment, the pain of betrayal and the sting of erasure faded, replaced by something stronger. The quiet assurance that legacy isn't just the walls you build or the patents you hold. It's the stories you pass down, the lessons you share, and the love that endures when the world turns its back. My grandson stayed for hours. We sifted through old ledgers and blueprints, his questions guiding us back to the spark of creation. And as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the floor, I realized I wasn't rebuilding alone. He was with me, listening, learning, carrying forward a truth no boardroom could ever erase. In the sunlight streaming through the tall windows of my new office, we began to assemble a gallery of origins, not as a tribute to the past, but as a declaration of truth. We hung a photograph of the battered old pickup truck that once hauled our first orders through a snowstorm, its headlights like beacons of hope guiding us forward. Beside it, the original leather-bound ledger lay open under glass, its yellowed pages inscribed with shaky numbers and dreams that defied logic. Above that, a candid shot of my wife and me, young, eager, our hands locked in a firm handshake that sealed a deal and bound our futures together. Each image held its own weight, a witness to moments that had shaped everything I had become. I traced a finger over the frame of a faded blueprint, recalling the late nights spent drafting our expansion, the arguments we weathered, the triumphs that felt as fragile as the paper they were drawn on. I remembered how easily history can be rewritten when those who lived it are silenced, how the absence of these stories would leave only an echo of someone else's version. That was why this wall mattered. It was armor against erasure, a testament that no boardroom maneuver or corporate memo could overwrite the blood and grit poured into every inch of those memories. As I stood back and surveyed our work, I felt the solid conviction of a man reclaiming his narrative. The final chapter would not be penned by the indifferent or the opportunists who once cast me aside. It would be written here, in living color and unvarnished honesty, by the man who built it all and the grandson who now bore witness. They whispered behind my back that I had outlived my purpose, that my hands were too worn, my mind too slow, my presence too cumbersome. They called me useless, an echo in halls that once resonated with my footsteps. So I gathered the heavy ring of keys I carried for 40 years and laid them on the polished mahogany table in the empty boardroom. I didn't linger for their thanks or their explanations. There were none to give. Behind me, I felt the silent weight of every bolt I tightened, every ledger I balanced, every risk I embraced. I felt the soft tremor of betrayal that had become the company's heartbeat when they thought I wasn't listening. And in that moment, I realized that true strength isn't proven through fights you win. It's shown by battles you choose not to wage. I walked away not out of weakness, but because I was finished justifying my own existence to people who had forgotten what I stood for. The empire they claimed as inheritance was never the real gift. It was merely the vessel for something far richer, values forged in late-night toil and dawn's first light. The genuine legacy, I knew, lay in the courage to close one door and step into a life defined by self-respect rather than others' approval. And so I left, every careful footprint marking the path of a man who refused to let silence become surrender. Now, when people speak of that company, they remember the quiet founder who walked away, keys surrendered but dignity intact. They remember the man who earned every nail, every patent, every victory, and who refused to let his worth be measured by the applause of those too proud to acknowledge it. My legacy wasn't stolen. I earned it, and it still stands, tall, unwavering, and entirely mine.